to be reading chapter 8 from Gaston Bachelard's Water and Dreams. Chapter 8, Violent Water. There is a very unfortunate tendency in our era to imagine that nature is reverie, laziness, and languor. Michelet, The Mountain. The ocean boils with fear. Dubartas. 1. As soon as we give dynamic psychology its true role, as soon as we begin to distinguish, as I have tried to do by considering the composition of water and earth, every matter in accordance with the human labor it induces or demands, we shall not be long in understanding that reality can never be well founded in men's eyes until human activity is sufficiently and intelligently aggressive. Then all the objects in the world receive their true coefficient of adversity. These activist overtones are not, I think, sufficiently expressed by phenomenological intentionality. The examples phenomenologists give do not show to great enough advantage the degrees of tension in intentionality. They remain too formal, too intellectual. Principles of intensive and material evaluation are lacking. Then, in a doctrine of objectivation, in a doctrine of objectivation that objectifies forms and not forces. Principles of intensive and material evaluation are lacking, then, in a doctrine of objectivation that objectifies forms and not forces. There must be at once a formal intention, a dynamic intention, and a material intention, so that an object can be understood in its force, resistance, and matter, that is, completely. The world is just as much the mirror of our times as it is the relation, the reaction to our strengths. The world is just as much the mirror of our times as it is the reaction to our strengths. If the world is my will, it is also my adversary. The greater the will, the greater the adversary. To understand Schopenhauer's philosophy well, we must keep human will in its position as initiator. In the battle of man against the world, it is not the world that initiates. We will bring Schopenhauer's insight to its conclusion. We shall compute the sum of intellectual representation and clear will from the world as will and representation in a formula. The world is my provocation. I understand the world because I surprise it with my incisive forces, with my direct forces, in the rightful hierarchy of my offenses, which are like embodiments of my joyous anger, my ever victorious, ever conquering anger. Insofar as he is a source of energy, a being is an a priori anger. A being is an a priori anger, insofar as he is a source of energy. From this activist point of view, the four material elements are four different types of provocation, four types of anger, and vice versa. If psychology is sufficiently concerned about the aggressive quality of our actions. It will find a quadruple root of anger in studies of material imagination. There it will see objective causes for those explosions that seem to be subjective. There it will find elements that symbolize crafty or violent, obstinate or vengeful anger. How can we hope to attain acuteness of judgment in this psychological quest without a sufficient wealth, without a forest of symbols? How can we convey all these returns, all these revivals of a reverie of power that is never satisfied, never weakened, if we have given no attention to the very diverse objective occasions in which it triumphs? If provocation is a notion that is indispensable for understanding the active role of our knowledge of the world, it is because psychology is not built upon defeats. We do not come to know the world all at once with a placid, passive, quiet knowledge. All constructive reveries, all there is nothing more essentially a builder than the reverie of power. And there is nothing more essentially a builder than, and there is nothing more essentially a builder than the reverie of power, are brought to life by the hope of surmounting adversity, by the vision of a vanquished adversary. We do not come to know the world at all. We do not come to know the world all at once with a placid, passive, quiet knowledge, all constructive reveries. And there is nothing more essentially a builder than the reverie of power, or brought to life by the hope of surmounting adversary, by the vision of a vanquished adversary. No one will find the vital, vigorous, real meaning of objective notions except by studying the psychological history of a proud victory over an adverse element. It is pride that gives dynamic unity to a being. That is what creates and stretches the nerve fibers. It is pride that gives the vital upsurge, Elan Vital, its reclinia traits, that is to say, its absolute success. It is the feeling of certain victory that gives the reflex its direction, its sovereign joy, its masculine joy in piercing reality. This victorious living reflex goes systematically beyond its former scope. It goes further. If it went only as far as the preceding action, it would be merely mechanical and animalized. Defense reflexes that truly bear the human stamp that man acquires, conditions, and holds ready are acts that defend while attacking. They are constantly dynamized by a will to attack. They are a response to an insult and not to a sensation. And let no mistake be made, the adversary who does the insulting is not necessarily a man, for things also question us. On the other hand, in his auspicious experimenting, man brutalizes the real. If we are willing to accept this anagenetic definition of a human reflex, dually dynamized by provocation, by a need to attack things, by work undertaken aggressively, we shall understand that victories over the four material elements are especially healthful, invigorating, and refreshing. These victories govern 4 types of health, 4 types of vigor and courage capable of furnishing categories for a classification of behavior that are perhaps more important than the theory of the 4 temperaments. An active hygiene characterized by the matters on which action is exerted, and how can we fail to give first place to the matter on which the action is exerted, to the matter that is being wrought, will therefore have naturally a quadruple root in natural life. The 4 elements determine dynamically, even more than materially, 4 types of therapy. 2. In order that this difference in the conquest of types of behavior and states of health, which come from a struggle with material elements, may be felt distinctly, we are going to study impressions of adversity, surmounted as closely as we can, still leaving them their profound material stamp. In order that this difference in the conquest of types of behavior and states of health, which come from a struggle with material elements, may be felt distinctly, we are going to study impressions of adversity surmounted as closely as we can, still leaving them their profound material stamp. Such will be the case for the dynamic genius of the man who walks against the wind, on the other hand, and of the swimmer who swims against the current, on the other. Since my aim in this work is to make a contribution to the psychology of literary creation, let us take up 2 literary heroes from the start to illustrate these remarks. Nietzsche, the walker, and Swinburne, the swimmer. Nietzsche patiently trained his will for power by means of long walks in the mountains, through a life in the open air, on their summits. On these summits, he loved the harsh divinity of the savage rock. His thought is in the wind. He makes a battle of walking. Better walking is his battle. This it is what gives rhythmic energy to Zarathustra. Zarathustra does not speak sitting down. He does not speak while strolling like a peripatetic. Peripatetic. He pronounces his doctrine while walking energetically. I suspect some irony there. He throws it out to the 4 winds of heaven. Thus, how easy is his vigor. Defeat comes rarely in a fight against the wind. A wind hero who could be knocked down by one gust would be the most ridiculous of all conquered generals. The hero who challenges the wind does not accept the reed's motto, I bend and do not break. For this is a passive motto, a motto that advises waiting and bending with power. It is not the active motto of the walker, for the dauntless walker bends forward in the face of the wind. His walking stick pierces the hurricane, makes holes in the earth, thrusts through the wind. Dynamically speaking, the walker in the wind is the reverse of the reed. No more sadness. The tears occasioned by the icy wind are the most artificial, the most exterior, the least sad of all tears. They are not feminine tears. The struggling walker's tears are not of sorrow, but of rage. They respond with anger to the anger of the tempest. The conquered wind will dry them, while waiting like the Annuncio, the walker, in the excitement of his battle, breathes in the sulphurous odor of the hurricane. The draped walker in the wind, how easily he symbolizes the victory of Samothrace, Samothrace. He immediately becomes a pennant, a flag, a standard. He is a sign of courage, a proof of power, the taking of a field. The coat whipped about by the hurricane is thus a sort of inherent flag, the untakeable flag of the wind hero. Walking against the wind in the mountains is no doubt the best way of conquering an inferiority complex. Conversely, this walking that needs no goal, this pure walking, like pure poetry, gives constant and immediate impressions of the will for power. It is the will for power in its digressive stage. The most timid men are great walkers. They win symbolic victories with each step. They compensate for their timidity with every blow struck by their walking stick. Far from cities and women, they seek the solitude of the heights. Flee, my friend, into thy solitude. Flee the struggle with men to discover pure struggle, the struggle with the elements. Go and learn to fight by fighting with the wind. And Zarathustra ends the stanza with these words: flee thither where a rough, strong breeze bloweth. 3. Now let us see the second tableau of the diptych. In water, victory is rarer, more dangerous, and more deserving of credit than victory in the wind. The swimmer conquers an element that is more alien to his nature. The young swimmer is a precocious hero. And what true swimmer was not first a young swimmer? The first attempts at swimming provide an opportunity for overcoming a fear. Walking does not have such a threshold for heroism. Besides, to this fear of a new element is associated a certain fear of the swimming instructor who often pushes his pupil into deep water. It is not surprising, therefore, that a slight Oedipus complex should manifest itself, with the swimming instructor playing the role of the father. Biographers tell us that at the age of 6, Edgar Allan Poe, who was later to be a daring swimmer, was afraid of water. A conquered fear is always succeeded by a certain pride. Madame Bonaparte quotes a letter from Poe in which he displays his pride as a swimmer. I did not think I was doing anything out of the ordinary by trying to cross the Strait of Calais between Dover and Calais. She also tells of scenes in which Poe, no doubt reliving old memories, plays the part of the energetic swimming instructor, of the swimming father, by throwing Helen's son, the son of the beloved, into the waves. Another young boy was initiated the same way. The game nearly turned out disastrously, and Poe had to leap into the water to save his pupil. Madame Bonaparte concludes, the profound Oedipal desire to take the father's place rose up from the depths of the unconscious to join these memories, already working in their fashion. No doubt in Poe's case, the Oedipus complex has other, more important sources, but it is, I feel, interesting to note that the unconscious multiplies father images and that all forms of initiation present Oedipal problems. Still, Edgar Allan Poe's Hydrus psyche remains exceptional. The active component that we have just grasped in Poe, the swimming instructor, is not able to overcome the melancholy component that remains the dominating feature of water insights in Poe's poetics. We shall turn to another poet to illustrate the virile experience of swimming. It is Swinburne who will allow us to portray the hero of violent water. Many pages could be written on Swinburne's thoughts and images pertaining to the general poetry of water. Swinburne spent his childhood hours near water on the Isle of Wight. Another of his grandparents' estates was 16 miles from Newcastle, where great parks extended over a section filled with lakes and rivers. The estate was bounded by the water of the Blythe River. How truly is one a landowner when the domain has natural frontiers such as this one? As a child, then, Swinburne knew the most delightful of all possessions, having a river of one's own. At that moment, the water images really belong to us. They are ours. We are they. Swinburne understood that he belonged to the water, to the sea. In gratitude to the sea, he writes, "Me, the sea, my nursing mother, me, the canal, green and haw, holds at the heart more fast than all things, bears for me the goodlier breast, lifts for me the lordlier love song, bids for me more sunlight shine, sounds for me the stormier trumpet of the sweeter strain to me." A ballad at parting. Paul de Roule has recognized the vital importance of such poems. He writes, "It is not only through metaphor that the poet calls himself the son of the sea and of the air and blesses these impressions of nature which give unity to an existence and bind together the child and the adolescent and the man." And in a note, de Roule quotes these verses from the Garden of Simdoshi. "Sea and bright wind and heaven and ardent air, more dear than all things earthborn, oh, to me, mother, more dear than love's own longing. Sea." How could one show that things, objects, forms, and the many-colored picturesqueness of nature are dispersed and effaced when the call of the element resounds? The call of water demands, as it were, a total offering, an inner offering. Water needs an inhabitant. It summons like a fatherland. In a letter to W.M. Rossetti that Lufshad quotes, Swinburne writes, I have never been able to be on the water without wanting to be in it. To see water is to want to be in it. At the age of 52, Swinburne tells us again of his ardor. I ran forward like a child, tore off my clothes, and threw myself into the water. It lasted only a few minutes, but I was in heaven. Let us go on, then, without lingering any longer over this dynamic aesthetics of swimming. Let us listen with Swinburne to the active invitation of the floods. Here is the leap, the casting, a first leap, a first casting into the ocean. As for the sea, its salt must have been in my blood before I was born. I can remember no earlier enjoyment than being held up naked in my father's arms and brandished between his hands, then shot like a stone from a sling through the air, shouting and laughing with delight, head foremost into the coming wave, which could only have been the pleasure of a very little fellow. Here we have an initiation scene of which no precise analysis has yet been made. On Swinburne's word, all the elements of suffering and hostility have been excised, and the status of a primary pleasure has been conferred on it. Scholars believe Swinburne when, at the age of 38, he writes to a friend, I remember being afraid of other things, but never of the sea. Such an affirmation amounts to forgetting the first drama, that drama which is always connected with a first act. It is the acceptance as substantial joy of the initiation festival that covers up, even in memory, the inner terror of the initiate. In point of fact, the leap into the sea, more than any other physical event, awakens echoes of a dangerous and hostile initiation. It is the only exact, reasonable image, the only image that can be experienced of a leap into the unknown. There are no other real leaps into the unknown. A leap into the unknown is a leap into water. It is the first leap of the novice swimmer, when an expression as abstract as leap into the unknown is found to be motivated by only one real experience. It is obvious evidence of its psychological importance. Literary criticism does not pay enough attention, I feel, to the real elements of images. In this example, it seems that we can sense how much psychological weight can be contained in a locution used as concretely as a leap into the unknown, when material imagination brings it back to its element. Man, equipped with his parachute, has a new experience along these lines. If material imagination works on this experience, it will open up a new field for metaphors. Let us then restore the truly primary, truly dramatic characteristics to initiation. When we have left our father's arms to be thrown like a stone from a fling into the unknown element, there can be no other first impression than bitter hostility. One feels like a very little fellow, the one who laughs with a mocking laugh, a wounding laugh, an initiator's laugh is the father. If the child laughs, it is a forced laugh, a constrained laugh, an astonishingly complex, nervous laugh. After the initial test, which may be very short, the childish laughter becomes natural again. A recurrent courage will make the first revolt. A recurrent courage will mask the first revolt. After the initial test, which may be very short, the childish laughter becomes natural again. A recurrent courage will mask the first revolt. The easy victory, the joy of being one of the initiated, the pride of having become like the Father, a water being, will leave the stone from the sling without rancor. The joys of swimming will wipe out the trace of the first humiliation. Eugenio Dios correctly saw the polyvalent characteristics of laughter from the water, while the guide who shows the Hellbrunn estate near Salzburg is displaying the bath of Perseus and Andromeda. A concealed mechanism makes 100 fountains play and sprinkle the visitor from head to foot. Eugenio Dios feels rightly that the laughter of the perpetrator of this joke and the laughter of his victims do not have the same tonality. The surprise bath, says Eugenio Dios, is a variety of the sport of auto-humiliation. Swinburne was also deceived by the impressions accumulated during his lifetime that have been superimposed over an initial impression when he wrote in Thea Brandon. It was rather desire than courage that attracted and attached him to the rough experience of water. He does not see the exact composition of desire and courage. He does not see, remembering his first courage when desire was absent, that the swimmer obeys the desire for courage. In an energetic experience like swimming, there is no alternating between desire and courage, only the vigorous action of a genitive. Like so many psychologists of the anti-psychoanalytic era, Swinburne slips into a simple analysis that plays on pleasure and pain as though they were isolated, separable, contrary entities. Swimming is ambivalent. The first swim is a tragicomedy. George Lafourcade has properly appreciated the co-anesthetic joy of violence. Coenesthetic George La Froissart has properly appreciated the co-anesthetic joy of violence. Throughout his fine work, he very rightly gives a place to numerous psychoanalytic themes. In pursuing La Froissart's thesis, I am going to attempt a classification of dynamic characteristics of marine experience. We are going to see how the elements of objective life symbolize with the elements of inner life in the muscular action required by swimming. There intervenes a specific ambivalence that will allow us to recognize a particular complex. This complex, which brings together so many characteristics of Swinburne's poetry, I would name the Swinburne complex. A complex is always the hinge of ambivalence. Around a complex, joy and sorrow are always ready to exchange their eagerness. In the experience of swimming, then, ambivalent dualities can be seen to accumulate. For example, cold water, when one triumphs over it courageously, gives a sensation of warm circulation. The result is an impression of special freshness, of tonic freshness. The sharp, sweet minute's kiss given of the water's waves lip of a breath's space curled. But these are ambivalences working on the will for power, which governs everything. The result is an impression of special freshness, of tonic freshness. The sharp, sweet minute's kiss given of the wave's lip of a breath's space curled. But these are ambivalences working on the will for power, which governs everything. As George La Froissart puts it, the sea is an enemy who sees to vanquish and whom we must vanquish. These waves are so many blows we must face. The swimmer has the feeling that he hurls his body against his adversary's limbs. Let us reflect on the very unusual nature of this personification, which is, nevertheless, so accurate. The combat is seen before the combatants. More precisely, the sea is not a body that can be seen, nor even a body that can be grasped. It is a dynamic environment that responds to the dynamic quality of our assaults. Even though visual images arise from the imagination and give a form to the adversary's limbs, we should certainly recognize that these visual images come second and in a subordinate position because of the necessity of conveying to the reader an essentially dynamic image that is itself primary and direct, and which, therefore, has its origin in dynamic imagination, in the imagination of courageous movement. This fundamental dynamic image is, then, a kind of struggle in itself. More than anyone else, the swimmer can say, "The world is my will. The world is my provocation. It is I who stir up the sea." To experience the taste, the ardor, the virile delights of this struggle in itself, let us not proceed too quickly to a conclusion, to the end of the exercise, when the swimmer rejoices in his success, finds peace in healthy fatigue. To characterize dynamic imagination, let us rather, as before, consider the action in the light of its premises. And even though we wish to construct an image of pure swimming as a specific type of pure dynamic poetry, let us first psychoanalyze the swimmer's pride when he dreams of his impeding prowess. We shall realize that his thought is an imagined provocation when even even in his reverie he is already saying to the sea, once more I am going to swim against you. I am going to fight, proud of my new strength, fully aware of my abounding strength against your countless waves. This exploit, dreamed by the will, is the experience about which poets of violent water sing. It is made up less of memories than of anticipation. Violent water is a schema for courage. A facade, however, proceeds a little too rapidly to the complexes of classical analysis. These general complexes must be rediscovered by psychological analysis. All individual complexes are, in point of fact, products of primitive complexes, but primitive complexes become capable of giving aesthetic experience only if they take on the distinctive characteristics of a cosmic experience by acquiring colorful features and by being embodied in objective beauty. If the Swinburne complex develops an Oedipus complex, the setting must be in proportion to the person. That is why only swimming in natural waters, in the middle of a lake or river, can awaken complexual forces. The swimming pool, with its ridiculous name, will never give its true setting to the working out of a complex. It will also fail to provide the ideal of solitude, so necessary for the psychology of a cosmic challenge. In order to project our will successfully, we must be alone. Poems about voluntary swimming are poems about solitude. The swimming pool will always lack the fundamental psychological element that makes swimming healthy from a moral point of view. Even though will furnishes the dominant theme for poetry about swimming, feeling naturally is also present. It is thanks to feeling that the special ambivalence of the struggle against water, with its victories and its defeats, can be included in the classic ambivalence of pain and joy. Moreover, we shall see that the ambivalence is unbalanced. Fatigue is the destiny of the swimmer. Sadism, sooner or later, must yield to masochism. First and foremost, in the exaltation of violent waters, sadism and masochism are, for Swinburne, quite mixed, as is fitting for a complexual nature. Swinburne says to the wave, my lips will feast on the foam of thy lips. Thy sweet, hard kisses are strong like wine. Thy large embraces are keen like pain. My lips will feast on the foam of thy lips. Thy sweet, hard kisses are strong like wine, thy large embraces are keen like pain. But there comes a moment when the adversary is the stronger, when consequently masochism comes to the fore. Then each wave hurts, each one cuts like a whip. The scourging of the surf made him red from the shoulders to the knees, and sent him on the shore whipped by the sea into a single blush of the whole skin. And faced with such metaphors, often repeated, La Faussade rightly calls to mind the ambivalent suffering of flagellation, which is so characteristic of masochism. If we recall now that this flagellation appears in a narrated swim, that is, as a metaphor of a metaphor, we will understand that this is a literary masochism, a virtual masochism. In the psychological reality of masochism, flagellation is a preliminary condition for pleasure. In literary reality, flagellation appears only as a consequence, as the sequel to excessive happiness. The sea flagellates the man whom the sea flagellates the man whom she has conquered and thrown up on the shore. Nevertheless, this inversion must not deceive us. The ambivalence of pleasure and pain marks poems as it marks life. When a poem strikes a dramatic, ambivalent note, we feel that it is the multiplied echo of a valorized moment, when the good and evil of a whole universe are bound together in the poet's heart. Once again, imagination can raise insignificant incidents of private life to the cosmic plane. The imagination is awakened by these dominant images. A great part of Swinburne's poetics can be explained through his dominant image of flagellation by the floods. Therefore, I consider myself justified in using Swinburne's name to designate a special complex. The Swinburne complex, I am sure, will be recognized by all swimmers. Above all, it will be recognized by swimmers who tell about their swimming experiences, who make poetry of their swimming. For this is one of the poeticizing complexes of swimming. It is therefore a useful theme for explaining and characterizing certain psychological conditions and certain poems. Byron could be the subject of a similar study. His work abounds in formula that arise from a poetics of swimming. He furnishes many variations on the fundamental theme. Thus, in the two Foscari, we read, "How many a time have I, cloven with arms still lustier, breasts more daring, the wave all roughened with a swimmer's stroke, flinging the billows back from my drenched hair, and laughing from my lip the audacious brine." Again I spurned it, the foam. The gesture of the hair flung back is in itself significant. It is the moment of resolution, the sign that the swimmer accepts the challenge of combat. This movement of the head marks a will to be the head of a movement. The swimmer truly comes face to face with the waves. Then the waves bound beneath me, says Byron in Childe Harold, as a steed that knows his rider. Of course, there are many other types of swimming besides the violent and active kind that we have just examined in this paragraph. A complete psychology of water could find passages in literature and in which a dynamic communion between the swimmer and the waves appears. For example, John Charpentier very aptly says of Coleridge, he surrenders himself to its dreamy seduction. He lolls in it like the Medusa in the sea, where she swims lightly, seeming to espouse the rhythm of its parachute-like swelling, to caress the currents with her soft, floating umbels. Through this image, lived so completely from a dynamic point of view, so faithful to the forces of material imagination, Jean Charpentier helps us to reach an understanding of the relaxed, volumetric swim at the precise dividing point between active and passive, floating and propulsion, which is allied to the reverie of rocking, for everything is related in the unconscious. This image is a great Coleridgean truth. Did Coleridge not write to Wedgwood in 1803? My whole being is filled with waves, as it were, that roll and stumble, one this way and one that way, like things that have no common master. Such is the dream of a man who cannot provoke the world. This will be the kind of swimming for a man who cannot provoke the sea. A study pursued further along these lines would allow me to go from types of swimming to pisciform metamorphosis. Pisciform metamorphosis. Then I would have to establish the natural history of imaginary fish. These imaginary fish are not very numerous in literature, for our dynamic imagination is weak with respect to water. In his story, The Waterman, Tieck has sincerely tried to describe the metamorphosis of a man dedicated to elementary water. Yet Giraldot's The Undine does not conform to mythical sincerity. It does not draw on a profound one-rick experience. The excuse offered is that Giraldot escapes as from a game which tires him quickly from these fish metaphors. He was unable to go from metaphor to metamorphosis. To ask a siren to do a split is nothing but a static formal joke lacking sympathy with the dynamic imagination of the waters. Since complexual psychology is often clarified by the study of weakened or derived complexes, I am now going to study Swinburne complexes that have lost their power. For the challenge to the sea also has its braggarts. From the shore, for instance, provocation is easier and is therefore more eloquent. It designates masked swim-borne complexes that are dressed up with very diverse aesthetic components. I shall examine some of these new aspects of reverie in literature that deal with water. For is there a more banal theme than that of the ocean's anger? A calm sea is suddenly seized with wrath. It grumbles and roars. It is given all the metaphors of fury, all the animal symbols of fury and rage. It shakes its lion's mane. Its foam resembles the saliva of a leviathan. Its foam resembles the saliva of a leviathan. A leviathan. I know the word, I'm just stumbling on it. Its foam resembles the saliva of a leviathan. The water is full of claws. Thus, Victor Hugo composed in Toilers of the Sea, an admirable psychology of the tempest. 4. Is there a more banal theme than that of the ocean's anger? A calm sea is suddenly seized with wrath. It grumbles and roars. It is given all the metaphors of fury, all the animal symbols of fury and rage. It shakes its lion's mane. Its foam resembles the saliva of a leviathan. The water is full of claws. Thus, Victor Hugo composed in Toilers of the Sea an admirable psychology of the tempest. In these passages, which have spoken so clearly to the minds of common men, Hugo gathers the most diverse metaphors, certain that he will be understood. It is because the psychology of anger is basically one of the richest and most varied. It goes from hypocrisy and cowardice to cynicism and crime. The number of psychological conditions projected is much greater for anger than for love. Metaphors for a good-natured, happy sea, therefore, will be less numerous than those for ill-natured sea. Since my primary purpose in this chapter is to clarify the principle behind dynamic projection, I shall study only one well-defined case of the projection of violence by setting aside, insofar as is possible, the influence of visual images, and by following certain attitudes that are part of the dynamic intimacy of the universe. For example, on several occasions, Balzac shows us in The Cursed Child a soul in complete accord with the sea's dynamic life. Etienne, the Cursed Child, is, so to speak, dedicated to the ocean's wrath. At the moment of his birth, a horrible tempest roared through the chimney, which re-echoed its smallest gusts while giving them a lugubrious sound, and the width of its flue put it in such close contact with the sky that the many logs on the hearth seemed almost to breathe. They glowed and dimmed by turns at the whim of the wind. This strange image, in which a chimney flue, like a rough, unfinished throat, awkwardly rationalizes. Its awkwardness is no doubt intentional. The hurricane's angry breathing. By this rude means, the ocean's prophetic voice carries into the most closed of rooms. This birth in a night of horrible tempests marks the life of the accursed child forever with a fatal sign. In the middle of his story, Balzac conveys his inmost thought to us. There is a correspondence in the Swedenborgian sense between the life of an enraged element and the life of an unhappy conscience. He had already, on several occasions, found a mysterious relationship between his emotions and the ocean's movements. The ability that his occult knowledge had given him to guess matter's thoughts made this phenomenon more meaningful to him than it would have been to anyone else. How can we recognize more clearly that matter possesses a thought, a reverie, and that it is not limited to thinking, dreaming, and suffering within us? Let us not forget that the occult knowledge of the cursed child is not clever magic. It has nothing in common with the learned skill of a Faust. It is both an obscure foreknowledge and a direct knowledge of the element's inner life. It has not been acquired in a laboratory by experimenting with substances, but in a face-to-face encounter with nature and the ocean, in solitary meditation. Balzac continues, during the fateful evening when he was going to visit his mother for the last time, the ocean was disturbed by movements which seemed to him extraordinary. Need I point out that an extraordinary tempest is a tempest seen by someone who is in an extraordinary psychological state? Then really there is between the universe and man an extraordinary correspondence, an internal, intimate, substantial communication. Correspondences are established in rare and solemn moments. Inward meditation provides contemplation in which the inmost recesses of the world are disclosed. Meditation with closed eyes and contemplation with wide open eyes suddenly have the same life. The soul suffers in things. To the distress of a soul correspondence, the misery of an ocean. The soul suffers in things. To the distress of a soul corresponds the misery of an ocean. There was a movement in the waters which showed that the sea was being disturbed internally. It was swollen by huge waves which broke on the shore with lugubrious sounds, like the howling of dogs in distress. Atene was surprised to discover that he was saying to himself, "What does it want from me? It labors and complains like a living creature." My mother often told me that the ocean was in the grip of horrible convulsions during the night I was born. What is going to happen to me? The convulsions of a dramatic birth thus increase in power until they are the convulsions of an ocean. From then on, the correspondence becomes more pronounced from page to page. After searching diligently for another self to whom he could confide his thoughts and whose life could become his own, he finally reached an intimate understanding with the ocean. The sea became for him a living, thinking being. The scope of these passages would be imperfectly grasped if nothing were seen in them but a banal animism, or even a literary device to animate the setting along with the character. But in fact, Balzac will discover psychological nuances so rarely noted that their novelty is a guarantee of genuine psychological observation. We must remember them as most informative observations for a psychology of dynamic imagination. Let us watch the will for power as it comes on the scene. Between Athene and the ocean, there is not merely a vague, indifferent sympathy. There is, above all, an angry sympathy, a direct and reversible communication of violence. It seems, therefore, that the objective signs of a tempest are no longer necessary for the cursed child to predict it. This prediction is not of a semiological type, semiological type. It is of a psychological order. It arises from the psychology of anger. Between two beings who grow angry, the first signs are trifles that are not deceptive. Is there a more intimate dialogue than the dialogue between two angers? The angry I and thou are born at the same instant, in the same atmosphere of dead calm. In their first manifestations, they are both direct and veiled. The angry I and thou continue their repressed life together. They are hidden and in evidence. Their hypocrisy follows a common pattern, one of almost conventional politeness. Finally, the angry I and thou burst out together in a warlike fanfare. They sound the same pitch. Between the cursed child and the ocean is drawn the same diagram of anger, the same scale of violence, the same agreement between two wills for power. Athene felt a real tempest in his own soul when the sea became angry. He breathed in his anger in sharp hisses. He ran along with the enormous tears which broke into 1,000 liquid fragments against the rocks. He felt as dauntless and as terrible as the sea itself, and like it bounded in prodigious retreats, he kept its dismal silences. He imitated its sudden mercies. Here, Balzac has discovered a genuine psychological feature that proves that the generality of a particular action. Here, Balzac has just discovered a genuine psychological feature that proves the generality of a particular action. The generality, it's italicized. Here, Balzac has just discovered a genuine psychological feature that proves the generality of a particular action. For who has not seen a lymphatic child on the seashore giving orders to the waves? The child calculates his command so that he will utter it at the moment when the wave will obey. He regulates his will for power, with the cycle of the swell that deposits its waves on the sand and pulls them back. He establishes within himself a sort of cleverly timed anger, in which a defense that is easy and an attack that is always victorious succeed one another. Let me read that again. Here, Balzac has just discovered a genuine psychological feature that proves the generality of a particular action. For who has not seen a lymphatic child on the seashore giving orders to the waves? The child calculates his command so that he will utter it at the moment when the wave will obey. He regulates his will for power with the cycle of the swell that deposits its waves on the sand and pulls them back. He establishes within himself a sort of cleverly timed anger in which a defense that is easy and an attack that is always victorious succeed one another. Dauntless, the child pursues the retreating water. He defies the hostile sea as it is retreating. While fleeing the advancing sea, he flouts it. All human battles are symbolized in this child's game. For hours on end, the child, commanding the waves, feeds in this manner a masked Swinburne complex, the Swinburne complex of a landsman. It seems to me that once all the forms of the Swinburne complex have been properly identified, literary criticism should attack more importance than it does to such. Literary criticism should attach more importance than it does to such characteristic passages. It seems to me that once all the forms of the Swinburne complex have been properly identified, literary criticism should attach more importance than it does to such characteristic passages. With his usual psychological depth, Michelet has noted the same scene. Every young imagination sees in the waves' violence an image of war, a combat, and at first is afraid. Then, observing that this fury has limits which it does not overstep, the child, reassured, hates more than fears the savage thing which seems to wish him harm. He, in turn, throws stones at the huge, roaring enemy. I observed this duel in Le Harvey in July 1831. In July 1831, a little girl whom I had brought there into the presence of the sea felt her youthful courage within her and became indignant over these challenges. She gave back war for war. She gave back war for war. An unequal fight, enough to bring a smile to the lips between the delicate hand of this fragile creature and the unspeakable might which took so little notice of it. It is, however, quite obvious that to understand a complex so well, one must participate in it oneself, and Michelet is a good example of this. Does he not seem to suffer philosophically from the fact that the ocean takes so little notice of men's courage? In such reciprocal challenges, the poorer the writer is, the more verbose the ocean. But still our pride is always aroused when the wave is fleeing. Everything which flies before us, though it be only inert, lifeless water, makes us valiant. In a novel by Jules Sandel, we find in many details the same masked Swinburne complex. When the ocean withdrew from the shore, Mariana loved to follow the fleeing wave and see it come back upon her. Then she in turn fled. She fled, but one step at a time, with unwilling step, as though she wanted to be caught. Sometimes it is the cries of the coast guardsmen that snatch her from the clutches of the wave which is on the point of devouring her. Further on, dramatizing the danger, Sando tells us that the billows leap like a hyena on Mariana, and waves trample on her body. We can see that the sea has an animal fury, a human fury. Here then is a novelist who must depict the revolt of a wounded soul, of a much beloved woman, betrayed by life, embittered by the most unjust of betrayals, and the writer finds nothing better to represent so intimate a revolt than the game of a child who defies the ocean. That is because images of our earliest imagination govern our entire life, because they are placed as if of their own will on the axis of human dramas. The Tempest gives us the natural images of passion, as Novalis, with his genius for direct expression, puts it. The Tempest encourages passion. Thus, when we go to the root of images, when we relive images in their basic matter and strength, we can discover the emotion in passages unjustly accused of declamation, as if declamation itself were not, by virtue of its beauty, a verbal tempest, a passion for expression. Thus, when we understand the realistic meaning of a Swinburne complex, we discover a note of sincerity in a passage like this one. O vanity of sorrow! In the presence of the sea, Mariana did not humble herself before this great sorrowful creature, which filled its banks with eternal lamentations. She thought she heard a soul answer her soul's sobs. There was established between them some sort of mysterious communication. When the swollen waves were leaping up in fury, mares with white manes, pale, windblown, she went down to the shore, and there, like the spirit of the tempest, she mingled her cries with the hurricane's clamor. Good, she said, walking against the wave. Good, tormented like me. This is the way I like you. And offering herself with somber joy to the icy spray which the wind threw into her face, she thought she received a kiss from her sister in despair. Need we underscore the nuance of this terrible, this active melancholy, a melancholy that desires the repeated insult of things after having already suffered men's insult? It is the melancholy of violet waters, very different from Poe's melancholy of dormant waters. The gentlest of souls can be surprised in the act of heroic compensation. The tender Marceline des Bordes Valmore, her oldest daughter, was named Ondine, tells how the tender Marceline des Bordes Valdemar, her oldest daughter, was named Ondine, tells how, coming back alone from America at the age of 15, she had herself fastened securely in the shrouds by the sailors, so as to be present without groans, without cries, without a murmur, at the moving spectacle of tempest and the fight waged by men against the unleashed elements, without making any judgment concerning the true facts of this distant memory, or wondering if it might not be one of those recurrent scenes of heroism so frequent in writers' childhood memories, without making any judgment concerning the true facts of this distant memory, or wondering if it might not be one of those recurrent scenes of heroism so frequent in writers' childhood memories. Let us note in passing the great prerogative of a psychology of the imagination. The exaggeration of an actual fact proves nothing, quite the contrary, against a fact of the imagination. The imagined fact is more important than the real fact. In Mathalin Desbordes Valmore's recollections, memory dramatizes. Therefore, we can be sure that the writer imagines. The drama of the young orphan girl has been engraven in a great image. Her courage in the face of life has found its symbol in her courage before the sea and fury. Moreover, there are cases in which we see a sort of guarded, controlled Swinburne complex in action. They provide, I believe, valuable confirmation of my thesis on dynamic imagination. What is true human calm? It is calm acquired by self-control. It is not natural calm. It is calm gained by defeating violence and anger. It disarms the adversary, imposes its calm on the adversary, declares peace in the world. We dream of a magic, reciprocal accord between the world and man. Edgar expresses this magic of the imagination with singular force in his great poem about Merlin the magician. What dost thou do to pacify the furious sea? I control my own anger. How could it be better stated? Anger is a basic means of understanding dynamic imagination. We give and receive it, we transmit it to the universe, and we curb it in our heart as in the universe. Anger is the most direct of all the transactions between man and things. It arouses no vain images, for it is the one that provides primary dynamic images. Violent water is one of the first settings for universal anger. Therefore, there can be no epic without a storm scene. J. Rouche notes this. He studies as a meteorologist the tempest described by Ronsard in the Franciae. Human grandeur needs to compare itself to the world's grandeur. Noble thoughts are born of noble sights, says Chateaubriand, after the description of the tempest in the Martyrs. In fact, there are passages in which the Swinburne complex gives life to a grandiose philosophy, in which a man conscious of his superhuman strength raises himself to the role of a dominating Neptune. Is it chance that makes Goethe partisan, as we know, of Neptunism in geology? One of the most obvious psychological Neptunes. In Faust Part 2 is found this passage. Faust. Mine eye was fixed upon the open sea. Aloft it towered, upheaving, then once more withdrew, and shook its waves exultingly, to storm the wide expanse of level shore that angered me, since arrogance of mood in the free soul that values every right through the impetuous passion of the blood, harsh feeling genders in its own despair. I deemed it chance, more keenly eyed the main. The billow paused, and then rolled back again, and from its proudly conquered goal withdrew. On through 1,000 channels it doth press, barren itself and causing barrenness. It waxes, swells, it rolls and spreads its reign over the waste and desolate domain. There, power-inspired wave upon wave sweeps on, triumphs a while, retreats, and naught is done. It to despair might drive me to survey of lawless elements the aimless sway. To soar above itself then dared my soul. Here would I strive, this force would I control. And it is possible, however the tide may rise, if on if round each hillock's side, however proudly it may domineer, each puny height, each crest doth gainest its rear. Each puny height its crest doth gainst its rear. Each puny height its crest doth gainst it rear. Each puny deep it forcefully allures. So swiftly plan on plan my mind matures. This glorious pleasure for thyself attain, back from the shore to bar the imperious main. Narrow the limits of the watery deep, constrain it far into itself to sweep. My purpose step by step I might lay bare. That is my wish, to aid it boldly dare. To curb the tumultuous sea with a glance, as Faust's will desires, to throw a stone at the hostile floods as Michelet's child does. These are the same image in dynamic imagination. It is the same dream of a will for power. This unexpected bringing together of Faust and a child may help us to understand that there is always a little naivete in the will for power. Excuse me. The destiny of the will for power is, in effect, to dream of power beyond actual power. Without this fringe of dream, the will for power would be powerless. It is through its dreams that the will for power is most aggressive. From to this point on, he who would be a Superman very naturally rediscovers the same dreams entertained by the child who would be a man. To govern the sea is a superhuman dream. It is both an inspired and a childlike will. 5. In the Swinburne complex, the masochistic elements are numerous. We can relate to the psychology of violent waters, a complex that is more clearly sadistic. It might be called the Xerxes complex. Let us look at an anecdote told by Herodotus. To this shore, then, beginning at Abydos, they on whom this task was imposed constructed bridges, the Phoenicians one with white flax, and the Egyptians the other with papyrus. The distance from Abydos to the opposite shore is 7 stades. When the strait was thus united, a violent storm arising broke in pieces and scattered the whole work. When Xerxes heard of this being exceedingly indignant, he commanded that the Hellespont should be stricken with 300 lashes with a scourge, and that a pair of fetters should be let down into the sea. I have moreover heard that with them he likewise sent branding instruments to brand the Hellespont. He certainly charged those who flog the water to utter these barbarous and pious words: "Thou bitter water, thy master inflicts this punishment upon thee, because thou hast injured him, although thou hast not suffered any harm from him. And King Xerxes will cross over thee, whether thou wilt or not. It is with justice that no man sacrifices to thee, because thou art both a deceitful and briny river." He accordingly commanded them to chastise the sea in this manner, and to cut off the heads of those who had to superintend the joining of the Hellespont. If this were an isolated anecdote, an unusual form of mental disorder, this passage would be of little importance for a study of the imagination. But quite the opposite is true, and the most extraordinary mental disorders are never exceptions. There is no lack of legends that take up anew the practice of the king of the Medes, Medes, Medes. After their incantations have failed, how many sorcerers have objectified their wrath by striking the marshy waters? St. Yves also reports on Bouqueville's authority the practice of the Turks who lived on the banks of the Inachus, still in use around 1826. By a petition properly drawn up and signed, the Turks inform the Cadi that the Inachus, having left its banks, is ruining their fields, and they beg him to order it to go back to its bed. The judge makes an award in accordance with their conclusions, and they are satisfied with this decision. But if the waters increase, then the Cadi, accompanied by all his people, descends to call upon the river to withdraw. They throw a copy of the judge's notice to it. The people call it a usurper. The people call it an usurper, a devastator. They throw rocks at it. The same practice is recounted in Achille Lillien's popular songs of Greece and Serbia. The wives of lost sailors assemble on the seashore. Each, in her turn, whips the surface of the floods. O sea, wicked sea, with your foaming waves. Where are our husbands? Where are our loved ones? All these scenes of violence obey the psychology of resentment, of symbolic and indirect vengeance. In the psychology of water, there are similar incidents of violence that employ another form of angry excitement. We shall see, by examining them attentively, that all the details of the psychology of anger are on the cosmic plane. In the practices of the Tempestarians, in fact, there is a clear psychology of teasing. To obtain the desired storm, the Tempestarian, the homophobia of the tempest, stirs up the waters as a child teases a dog. A fountain is enough for him. He comes to the edge of the water with his hazel wand, his Aaron's rod. With its pointed end, he scratches the fountain's transparent mirror. He jerks it back out with an abrupt gesture. He pushes it in again. He pricks the water, the tranquil and placid water, which in repose is truly watered like a skin which nothing can hurt, is finally irritated. The water's nerves are now raw. Then the Tempestarian plunges his wand down to the mud. He lashes the spring right down to its entrails. This time the element becomes angry. Its anger becomes universal. The storm rumbles, lightning flashes, hail rattles down, and water inundates the earth. The Tempestarian has fulfilled his cosmological task. In so doing, he projects a psychology of teasing, certain to find in water all the characteristics of a universal psychology. In St. Tees' Folklore of the Waters, there are numerous examples of the Tempestarians' practices. Let me recount a few of them very briefly. In Nicholas Remy's Demon Worship, we read the following. It was declared by the free and spontaneous assertion of more than 200 persons that two men condemned to be burned as sorcerers met on certain days on the banks of a pond or river, and that there, armed with a black rod which they had received from the demon, they struck the water heavily until there were raised up abundant vapors that carried them off into the air. Then, having accomplished their artifices, they fell back down to earth in the midst of torrents of hail. Certain lakes are particularly excitable. They react immediately to the slightest teasing. An ancient historian of the counties of Byron and Navarre reports that there are in the Pyrenees, touched by the fire and broken by the ordinary lightning which originates in the pond. Another chronicler mentions a little lake 4 leagues from Badaj, into which neither earth nor stone nor any other object may be thrown without the skies becoming immediately troubled by rain or tempest. Pampanios Mela also calls attention to a particularly susceptible fountain. When a man's hand happens to touch a rock on its bank, then immediately the fountain swells to immoderate size and causes swirls of sand, like the waves of a sea stirred up by a tempest to fill the air. There are, as we have seen, sensitive waters. I could discuss numerous variations on this theme to show that the offense given waters can lessen physically without changing the reaction of the violent waters in any way. I could show that the offense might not be flagellation, but mere threat. The touch of a fingernail, the slightest stain, can arouse water's anger. My task as a literary psychologist would not be complete if I were to limit myself to quoting legends and ancient stories. As a matter of fact, Xerxes' complexes are demonstrably active in certain writers' reveries. I shall relate a few cases. First of all, there is an instance where there is only a faint trace of the complex, in which the offense given the waters is scarcely more serious than scorn. It is in Edgar Quinet's Chevreau. The king, haughty and sure of his will for power, provokes the ocean that is swelling up for a flood in these words: "Ocean, distant sea, have you really counted ahead of time the steps of my tower? Take care, poor angry child, that your foot not slip on my flagstones, and that your saliva not dampen my stairs. Before climbing one half of my steps, ashamed, panting, hiding yourself under your spray, you will go back to your home thinking, I am tired." In Ossian, it is often with a sword that men combat the tempest. In the third book, Kalmar marches against the floods with naked blade. When the lowered cloud passes near him, he seizes its black particles and plunges his steel into its shadowy fog. The spirit of the tempest abandons the air. Men fight against things as they fight against other men. The spirit of battle is always the same. Sometimes the metaphoric direction reverses itself. Sometimes the metaphoric direction reverses itself. It is the resistance to the sea that lends its images to the resistance to men. Victor Hugo depicts Mess Lethere thus: "Never had heavy weather caused him to retreat. That was because he was not very open to contradiction. He tolerated no more from the ocean than from another. He meant to be obeyed. Too bad for the sea if it resisted. It would have to make up its mind. Miss Lethere did not yield. A wave that rises succeeded no better in stopping him than did a quarreling neighbor." Man is an integrated being. He has the same will against all adversaries. All resistance awakens the same wish. In the realm of will, there is no distinction to be made between things and men. The image of the sea retiring, vexed from the resistance of a single man, does not call forth any criticism from the reader. If we reflect carefully on this matter, we will see that this image is simply a metaphor for Xerxes' senseless act. A great poet rediscovers primitive thoughts, and under his pen, the naivete of the legend fades before an indefinable legendary beauty. Xerxes caused the Hellespont, which had revolted, to be branded with a red-hot iron. Claudel rediscovers this image without thinking, it seems, of Herodotus' text. At the beginning of the first act of Break of Noon, there is a splendid image which I quote here from memory. The sea, with its resplendent spine, is like a cow that has been thrown down to be branded. Does this image not have the moving beauty of an evening sky that wounds the astonished sea and draws blood? It is drawn from nature by a poetic nature, far from the books and advice learned in school. Such passages are of incalculable value for my thesis. They show that poetry is a natural and durable synthesis of images that are only artificial in appearance. The conqueror and the poet both want to put the brand of their power on the universe. They both take the branding iron in hand. They brand the dominated universe. What seems senseless to us when part of history and in the past is now in the eternal present a profound truth of free imagination. Metaphor, physically inadmissible, psychologically absurd, is nevertheless a poetic truth. It is because metaphor is a phenomenon of the poetic soul. It is also a phenomenon of nature, a projection of human nature on universal nature. 6. Even when one has included all these legends, all these mental disorders, all these poetic forms under the heading of animism, there is more to be said. We must realize that this kind of animism truly animates. It is an extremely subtle animism that goes into detail and unerringly discerns all the nuances of an impressionable and voluntary life in the inanimate world that reads nature like a changing human countenance. Anyone who wishes to understand the psychology of the imagination conceived as a natural faculty and no longer as a faculty acquired through training, must ascribe a place to this prolix animism, to an animism that animates everything, projects everything, mingles on every occasion, desire and vision, inner impulses and natural forces. Then he or she will, as he or she should, once more put images before ideas. First will come natural images, those that nature gives directly, those that follow both the laws of nature and the laws of our nature, those that take on the matter and movement of natural elements, the images that we feel to be active within ourselves, within our organs. No matter what human action is considered, we can perceive that it does not have the same flavor in the midst of men as in the midst of fields. For example, when a child in the sawdust pit of a gymnasium strains in the broad jump, he feels only a human rivalry. If he comes in first in the event, he is the first among men. But what a different pride, what a superhuman pride comes from jumping over a natural obstacle, from crossing the creek in one leap. Being alone affects this pride not at all. He is first in nature's order, and the child playing endlessly under the willows goes from one meadow to another, master of two worlds, braving the tumultuous water. How many images have their natural origin there? How many reveries acquire their taste for power, for triumph, for scorn toward what can be overcome? The child who jumps over the creek in a broad meadow can dream of adventures, strength, drive, and daring. He really has 7-league boots on his feet. The jump across a creek as natural obstacle is, moreover, the one most similar to the jump we like to make in our dreams. If anyone should try, as I am suggesting, to find before the threshold of his actual experiences those imaginary experiences that he has in the great land of his sleep, then he would realize that in the realm of imagination and of reverie, the day has been given to us so that we may verify the experiences of our nights. Charles Claudel writes in his Reveries, one of the most ingenuous and profound philosophers of our times told me that, having dreamed several nights in a row in his youth, that he had acquired the marvelous ability to hold himself up and to move about in the air. He could never convince himself that this impression was not true, except by making the attempt when crossing a stream or a ditch. The sight of a stream reawakens distant dreams. It vitalizes our reverie. Conversely, literary images, when correctly dynamized, also dynamize the reader. They govern in kindred souls a sort of physical hygiene of reading, and imaginary gymnastics of the nervous system. The nervous system needs such poems. Unfortunately, in our confused poetics, we cannot easily find our personal system. Rhetoric, with its insipid encyclopedia of the beautiful, with its childish rationalizations about the obvious, does not allow us to be truly faithful to our element. It prevents us from following in full flight the real phantom of our imaginary nature, which, if it ruled our lives, would give us back the truth of our being, the energy of our own dynamism.